It was a typical morning in the heart of Lafayette, Louisiana, the vibrant city known as the hub of Cajun country, where the humid southern air carried the rich scents of nearby bayous, fresh coffee and morning bakeries, and where daily life moved with the warm, unhurried rhythm that defined so many communities across the Pelican State. And it was on such a morning that Senator John Neely Kennedy, the Republican senator from Louisiana, famous for his straightforward, no-nonsense style, and his deep commitment to traditional American values like hard work, personal responsibility, and profound respect for those who had served the nation, decided to stop at the local Safeway grocery store to pick up a simple cup of coffee before heading to his office for the day. And he was dressed casually in a way that let him blend right in with his constituents: comfortable jeans that had seen plenty of real-world use, a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up for ease, and a well-worn baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Nothing about his appearance hinting that he was a United States senator who spent his days fighting for Louisiana's interests in Washington. For Kennedy, these everyday errands were meaningful. They kept him connected to the real people he represented: the hard-working families, farmers, and veterans scattered across the parishes, small towns, and Cajun communities of his home state. As he pushed open the glass doors of the Safeway, the cool rush of air conditioning welcomed him, blending with the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the self-serve station, and the warm scent of fresh bread and pastries from the bakery section, and the clean, familiar smell of the store's morning routine. The store was moderately busy with the usual morning crowd, locals stopping in for quick breakfast items for their families, grabbing forgotten groceries on their way to work or school, or simply running a quick errand. The soft hum of conversations, laced with that unmistakable Cajun and Southern drawl, mixing with the steady beeps of checkout scanners and the rustle of shopping baskets being filled. Kennedy moved through the aisles with the same unassuming demeanor he brought to everything in life, selecting a strong black coffee from the self-serve station, bold and straightforward, just like his personality, and grabbing a newspaper from the nearby rack, and his mind briefly touching on the legislative issues and constituent concerns awaiting him later in the day, yet staying fully grounded in the present moment, appreciating the simple pleasure of being just another customer rather than the focus of attention. He chose lane 3 for checkout, noticing it had only one person ahead of him, an elderly man who appeared to be in his late 70s or early 80s, wearing a faded and well-worn Army veteran baseball cap that had clearly endured many years under the Louisiana sun, paired with a jacket that had seen better days, the kind of practical, no-frills clothing that spoke of a life lived with quiet resilience, modesty, and the steady dignity of someone who had given much to his country without seeking recognition. This man was Harold Whitaker, though Kennedy did not yet know his name, and he carried a small basket holding only the most essential items: a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a gallon of milk, and a small package of lunch meat, the modest kind of shopping list made by someone carefully stretching a fixed income, buying just enough to get through the next few days without any extras or luxuries. The cashier, a young woman in her early 20s named Ashley, scanned the items one by one with practiced efficiency and announced the total in a professionally neutral tone. "That'll be $18.73. Harold reached into his pocket with weathered hands and pulled out a worn leather wallet that looked nearly empty. No bills visible, only a handful of coins. He began counting them out carefully on the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, so the kind of careful counting that came from years of making every penny count in the face of life's challenges. Kennedy stood quietly behind him, his Louisiana upbringing teaching him patience and respect, allowing him to observe without showing any impatience. But as the minutes passed and Harold continued counting, quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies, softly muttering the numbers to himself, finally reaching only $16.26. The senator could sense the growing discomfort in the air around them. Harold's face, once calm, now showed clear embarrassment as he looked up at Ashley, and admitted quietly that he was short, his voice barely above a whisper, explaining that he thought he had brought more. Ashley sighed audibly, her expression revealing she had seen this kind of situation before. And her patience was beginning to thin as the line behind Kennedy started to lengthen with other morning shoppers. "Sir, you're $2.47 short," she said, suggesting he would need to put something back to complete the purchase. Harold's face flushed with a deeper shade of embarrassment, his hands developing a slight tremor as he looked down at his modest groceries. The simple basics that represented his daily survival, nothing extravagant, just food to keep him going. He proposed putting the lunch meat back, then hesitated and asked about the price of the milk, attempting to calculate in his head what combination of items he could afford with his limited $16.26. The situation dragged on, turning into a public moment of vulnerability that no one, especially a man who had likely served his country with honor decades earlier, he should have to face under the bright lights of a grocery store checkout. Behind Kennedy, another customer muttered something under their breath about people holding up the line, the words adding a layer of subtle tension to the morning rush. Kennedy, however, remained still and observant, his heart stirred with a growing sense of empathy and recognition for exactly what he was witnessing. This wasn't carelessness or poor planning. This was a veteran whose faded army cap was a silent testament to real service and sacrifice, now quietly struggling with the hard realities of a fixed income that didn't always stretch far enough for even the most basic necessities of life. As a senator from Louisiana, Kennedy had heard countless stories from veterans during town halls, church gatherings, fish fries, and visits across the parishes. Stories of men and women who had worn the uniform with pride, faced the hardships of war, and returned home to sometimes find the system falling short in supporting them. This particular moment hit him especially hard, reminding him strongly of the core Louisiana values his family and community had instilled in him from a young age: the sacred duty to honor those who had defended the nation, the importance of showing compassion without judgment, and the belief that genuine community meant stepping up to help one another during times of quiet struggle. He thought about the many veterans he had met throughout Louisiana, in Lafayette's Cajun communities, in the rural parishes, and in small towns across the state. Men who had served in Vietnam or later conflicts, now navigating disability payments, rising living costs, and the daily challenge of preserving their dignity in their later years. The slight tremor in Harold's hands wasn't just from age, it carried the emotional weight of having to count coins for basic food in front of strangers on an ordinary morning. Kennedy's Louisiana roots ran deep, shaping his strong sense of respect for veterans, and his conviction that no one who had sacrificed for this country should ever feel ashamed or invisible when facing hardship. The line behind him continued to grow, the morning bustle of the Lafayette Safeway making the delay more noticeable, yet Kennedy's attention remained fixed on the veteran ahead, his empathy deepening with every passing second. The familiar sounds of the store, the beeps of registers, soft Southern and Cajun-accented conversations nearby, and the occasional store announcement formed a living backdrop to this poignant human scene. For Kennedy, this was far more than a simple checkout delay. It was a powerful reminder of the everyday realities many veterans across America, and especially in loyal military communities like those in Louisiana, still faced long after their service had ended. The morning light streamed through the store windows, casting a warm glow over the scene and highlighting the simple but deeply meaningful moment unfolding in Lane 3. Senator John Neely Kennedy stood there in quiet reflection, his mind filled with thoughts about the veteran support policies he had championed, the conversations he had led in the Senate, and the personal responsibility he felt to live out the values of gratitude, humility, and kindness in his own daily life as a Louisianan. This ordinary morning in a Lafayette Safeway had quietly become a place of profound empathy for the senator, the kind that stirred something meaningful inside him as both a public servant and a man shaped by the resilient, community-oriented spirit of Louisiana. The details of the moment, the faded Army veteran cap, the deliberate counting of coins, the modest basket of groceries, and the quiet but visible embarrassment on Harold Whitaker's face, all reinforced Kennedy's long-held belief that small acts of human kindness could create real change, and that no veteran should ever have to feel alone or diminished in moments like this. As Harold continued sorting through his limited options, trying to decide what to set aside, the slight tremor in his hands remaining visible, Kennedy's compassion grew even stronger, his internal sense of duty, both as a senator and as a proud Louisianan, reminding him that this was precisely the kind of everyday situation where true character revealed itself, not through grand gestures or speeches, but through quiet understanding and the willingness to help without seeking praise. The store's morning activity continued around them, but in Lane 3, a deeper story of human dignity, quiet struggle, and the potential for genuine kindness was gently unfolding, all beginning with this simple, observant moment on an ordinary morning in Lafayette, Louisiana. In that checkout line, surrounded by the comforting sights, sounds, and smells of home, with the humid Louisiana air still lingering on people's clothes from outside, Senator John Neely Kennedy stood as a silent witness, and his heart and mind aligned in a way that would soon lead to meaningful action, all firmly rooted in the values that had defined his life and his dedicated service to the people of Louisiana. As the subtle tension in Lane 3 continued to build under the bright lights of the Lafayette Safeway, with Harold Whitaker still standing there with his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over his modest groceries, and the faint tremor in his fingers revealing the quiet weight of embarrassment he was carrying, Senator John Neely Kennedy felt a deep, unmistakable pull from within, the kind of instinctive call to action rooted in the Louisiana values he had been raised with, and the belief that real strength wasn't found in grandstanding or waiting for someone else to step up, but in quietly doing what was right when the moment demanded it. And without a second of hesitation, he stepped forward from his place in line, his casual jeans and button-down shirt still making him look like any other local rather than a United States senator. And in that calm, straightforward voice that had become his trademark both in the Senate chamber and back home in the parishes, he spoke clearly enough for Ashley the cashier and Harold to hear. "Ring it all up together," he said simply, placing his steaming cup of black coffee and the newspaper on the belt right behind Harold's items. "His groceries and mine. One transaction." Ashley looked up with a flicker of surprise in her eyes, her hands pausing over the register as she processed the unexpected request, while Harold turned slowly, his face shifting from embarrassment to confusion as he met Kennedy's steady gaze. "Sir, I can't let you do that," Harold began, his voice cracking slightly with the pride of a man who had served his country and wasn't accustomed to accepting help, especially not from a stranger in the middle of a busy morning store. "I appreciate it, but I don't want charity. I'll just put the lunch meat back like I said." Kennedy offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and carried the easy warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime talking with folks across Louisiana's bayous and small towns, And he replied in that no-nonsense yet kind Louisiana drawl that made his words feel both firm and reassuring. "You're not letting me do anything, friend. I'm buying my coffee and my paper anyway, and your items happen to be right there in front of mine on the belt. That's just how checkout lines work in Louisiana. We look out for each other without making a big fuss about it." He nodded gently toward Ashley, encouraging her to proceed, and as she scanned the milk and lunch meat back into the total, along with Kennedy's coffee and newspaper, the senator reached for his wallet, with the same unassuming calm he brought to every part of his life. Harold stood there blinking, still processing the moment, his faded Army veteran cap slightly askew as he tried to find the words to protest again. But Kennedy continued speaking softly, his tone carrying the deep respect he had always shown for those who had worn the uniform. "What branch were you in?" he asked, keeping the conversation natural and respectful, the kind of question that came from a man who truly wanted to know rather than just fill the silence. Harold, caught off guard by the genuine interest, answered automatically, his voice gaining a touch of quiet pride. "Army, Vietnam, 68 to 70. Kennedy's expression softened with sincere admiration, the kind that came from years of listening to veterans' stories during town halls and community events across Louisiana, and he replied without hesitation, "Thank you for your service, sir. That's something no one can ever take away from you." The words landed with quiet power, not as political rhetoric, but as the heartfelt acknowledgement of one American to another who had sacrificed in ways most people could only imagine. And Harold nodded slowly, his eyes misting slightly as the weight of the simple gratitude settled over him. By now, the total had come up on the register, $22 and change, and Kennedy handed over his card without fanfare, the transaction processing smoothly, while Ashley kept her professional composure even as she began to sense there was something more to this customer than met the eye. The line behind them had grown longer, but the earlier mutters of impatience had quieted into curious silence as a few shoppers started to notice the unusual exchange unfolding in Lane 3, the soft southern morning light filtering through the store windows and casting a gentle glow over the scene. Kennedy turned back to Harold, his voice remaining low and reassuring so as not to draw unnecessary attention. "So you go ahead and take your groceries, and have a good day. That's all that matters here." Harold accepted the separate receipt Ashley handed him, still looking a bit stunned, his hands no longer trembling quite as much now that the immediate pressure of the shortage had been lifted. Yet he hadn't yet connected the dots about who this helpful stranger truly was. The baseball cap, the casual clothes, and the humble demeanor had kept Kennedy's identity hidden for the moment. Inside, Kennedy felt a profound sense of rightness. This wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. It was about living out the Louisiana spirit he believed in so strongly. The idea that when you see someone struggling, especially a veteran who had given so much for the country, you don't just stand by and watch. You act with quiet decency because that's what decent people do. His thoughts drifted briefly to the many veterans he had met throughout Lafayette and the surrounding parishes, men and women whose stories of service and subsequent challenges had shaped his legislative priorities back in Washington, and this simple act in the Safeway felt like a direct extension of those values, a reminder that leadership wasn't only about bills and speeches, but about the everyday moments where human connection mattered most. The store's familiar sounds, the beeps of other registers, the soft Cajun-inflected conversations in nearby aisles, and the occasional page over the intercom, continued around them, but the atmosphere in Lane 3 had begun to shift noticeably, a subtle warmth spreading as a couple of customers exchanged quiet glances, sensing that something genuine and kind was happening right in front of them. Harold picked up his now paid-for bag of groceries, still murmuring his thanks under his breath, his pride intact because Kennedy had framed the help not as charity, but as a simple, practical courtesy between fellow Louisianans. Kennedy grabbed his own coffee and newspaper, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from doing the right thing without needing recognition, his mind already reflecting on how these small acts of compassion could ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict, reinforcing his lifelong belief that America's strength lay in its people looking out for one another, especially for those who had defended the nation's freedoms. As the two men stood there for a brief moment at the end of the checkout, through the morning bustle of the Lafayette Safeway flowing on around them, Kennedy's presence remained low-key and unassuming. Yet the seeds of something larger had been planted in that ordinary grocery store aisle, a moment of quiet humanity that would soon touch more lives than either man could have imagined, all beginning with a single, straightforward decision to step forward and say, "I've got this," in the true spirit of Louisiana community and respect for those who had served. The transaction was complete, the groceries were bagged, and Harold Whitaker walked away from the counter with his basic necessities now taken care of, still unaware of the full identity of the man who had just made his morning lighter, while Senator John Neely Kennedy followed a few steps behind. And carrying his coffee, and reflecting deeply on the power of simple kindness in a world that too often forgot the quiet struggles of its veterans, his heart steady with the knowledge that he had lived out his values in the most unassuming way possible on this ordinary morning in Lafayette. In that brief, charged moment, right after the transaction had been completed at the checkout lane 3 of the Lafayette Safeway, with Harold Whitaker holding his bag of paid-for groceries and Senator John Neely Kennedy gathering his coffee and newspaper, something shifted in the air as Harold turned one last time to thank the helpful stranger who had just eased his burden without making a scene. And as their eyes met under the bright store lights, the elderly veteran's expression changed from grateful confusion to wide-eyed recognition that spread slowly across his weathered face like the first light of dawn breaking over the Louisiana bayous. "Are you?" Harold started, his voice catching with emotion, the faded army cap on his head suddenly feeling heavier with the weight of the moment. "You're Senator John Neely Kennedy, aren't you?" The words came out thick and unsteady, carrying the unmistakable tremor of a man who had just realized he had been helped not by an ordinary shopper, but by one of Louisiana's own voices in Washington, a man whose straightforward speeches and strong defense of traditional values had reached people far beyond the halls of Congress. Kennedy gave a small, humble nod, his casual demeanor unchanged as he replied quietly, "Sir, just picking up coffee like everyone else, sir." But for Harold Whitaker, that simple confirmation unlocked a flood of emotion that had been building for years, the kind of deep, heartfelt surge that came from a lifetime of quiet struggles after returning from Vietnam, where the welcome home had not always been kind, and the years that followed had tested his resilience in ways civilians could rarely understand. His eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide, and his voice grew thick as he spoke from the heart, the words pouring out in a raw, genuine stream that silenced the immediate area around them. "I can't believe this. Thank you, Senator. Not just for the groceries, though God knows that means the world to me today, but for everything. Your straight talk, the way you stand up for regular folks and for veterans like me, it's meant more than you know. After I got back from Vietnam, things were rough, real rough. Jobs were hard to find, people looked at us differently, and some days it felt like the whole world had moved on while we were still carrying the weight of what we'd seen. But hearing you speak over the years, talking about honor, responsibility, and not forgetting those who served, it reminded me that there were still people who understood. It gave me something to hold on to when the nights got long and the bills piled up. The confession hung in the air, honest and vulnerable, and Kennedy listened with the full attention and respect that defined his character, his own expression softening noticeably as he responded with the humility that had always set him apart in politics. "You went through real hell over there, Mr. Whitaker. I've only read about it and listened to the stories. What you and your brothers in arms did? That's what truly matters. I just try to speak up for the values this country was built on and make sure voices like yours aren't forgotten in Washington." The exchange was quiet, yet powerful, the kind of genuine human connection that rarely happened in the middle of a busy grocery store. And by now, the entire area around Lane 3 had fallen into a respectful silence. Ashley, the cashier, stood motionless behind the register, her eyes glistening as she witnessed the moment unfold. Customers in the growing line behind them had stopped shifting impatiently and were watching with quiet attention, and a few pulling out their phones not to record for spectacle, but simply to capture the authenticity of what was happening. Word seemed to spread subtly through the store as people in neighboring lanes paused their own shopping, drawn by the unusual hush and the visible emotion on Harold's face. What had started as one man's quiet act of kindness had now become something larger, a living reminder of gratitude, sacrifice, and the shared bond that connected Louisianans across generations and backgrounds. Encouraged by the warmth of the moment, an older woman who had been waiting a few spots back in line stepped forward gently and pressed a $20 bill into Harold's hand. "For later," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle strength of someone who had seen hardship herself. "When the timing of the bills gets tight again." My father was in World War II. Someone helped him once when he needed it most, and this is me paying that forward." Harold tried to protest, his pride rising again, but the woman closed his fingers around the bill with kind insistence, and in that instant, something remarkable began to happen. Other customers started approaching, not in a chaotic rush, but with quiet, respectful gestures. A man in a work shirt pulled out a $50 bill and handed it over with a simple nod. A mother with 2 young children added a 20 of her own, whispering that she wanted her kids to see what kindness looked like. Even the young bagger, who couldn't have been earning much more than minimum wage, reached into his pocket and offered a $10 bill, his face earnest and sincere. Within just a couple of minutes, Harold Whitaker found himself standing at the end of the checkout with over $200 in cash that strangers had freely given him, along with his groceries already paid for, a gift card that Ashley had quietly slipped him from the store's employee discretionary fund, money she admitted later came from her own pocket, and an overwhelming sense of being seen and valued, rather than pitied. The atmosphere in the Lafayette Safeway had transformed completely. What had been a place of mild morning rush and occasional impatience was now filled with a rare, warm sense of community. People who had never spoken to one another before were making eye contact, smiling, and exchanging soft words of encouragement. Kennedy stood slightly to the side, watching it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, his own contribution having served as the spark that ignited this chain reaction of human goodness. He spoke a few more words to Harold, reinforcing the respect he felt for the veteran's service, and reminding him that he was not alone in Louisiana, or in the broader fight to honor those who had worn the uniform. The moment carried a profound emotional weight, touching everyone present, and reminding them that behind the daily routines and struggles there existed a deeper capacity for compassion that could surface when given the chance. As Harold wiped his eyes and tried to find the words to express what he was feeling, the store seemed to breathe with a new energy. Shoppers who had been in a hurry now lingered a little longer. Conversations turned warmer, and the simple act of one man stepping forward had created a ripple effect that spread far beyond that single checkout lane. For Senator John Neely Kennedy, this was the Louisiana he believed in and fought for every day in Washington, a place where people still looked out for one another, where veterans were honored not just with words, but with actions, and where small, heartfelt gestures could restore dignity and hope to someone who had given so much. The morning in the Safeway had become something far greater than a routine grocery run. It had turned into a powerful testament to the enduring spirit of community, gratitude, and the quiet strength that came from living out one's values in the most ordinary of settings, leaving everyone who witnessed it with a renewed sense of connection and the quiet knowledge that kindness, even when offered without fanfare, could light up even the most routine morning in Lafayette, Louisiana. In the weeks and months that followed that ordinary morning at the Lafayette Safeway, the simple act of kindness shown by Senator John Neely Kennedy quietly grew into something much larger than anyone standing in Lane 3 could have imagined, transforming not only Harold Whitaker's final chapter of life, but also leaving a lasting mark on the store, the local community, and everyone fortunate enough to witness the ripple effect of one man's decision to step forward with quiet compassion. The very next day, Ashley, the young cashier, shared the full story with her manager during the afternoon shift, her voice still carrying the emotion of what she had seen. And by evening, the tale had reached Safeway's regional office. I moved by the genuine humanity of the moment and the powerful way it had united complete strangers. The company quickly decided to establish a permanent Veterans Assistance Fund at that specific Lafayette location, a discreet program that allowed employees to quietly help veterans who found themselves short at checkout without causing embarrassment or drawing attention. They named the fund in honor of Harold Whitaker, ensuring that his name would be remembered not as a symbol of struggle, but as a reminder of dignity restored through community kindness. Harold himself returned to the same Safeway every week after that day, no longer counting coins with trembling hands, but greeted warmly by name by the staff and many regular customers who had been present or heard the story. The extra cash he received that morning, more than $200 from generous strangers, allowed him to catch up on a utility bill that had been weighing heavily on his mind, giving him a small but meaningful sense of security and peace in his later years. He carried himself with a renewed lightness, the faded Army veteran cap now worn with quiet pride rather than quiet shame, and he often spoke to his nephew about how that single morning had changed the way he viewed the world and his place in it. "I felt invisible for so long," Harold told his nephew during one of their quiet conversations on the porch. "Like my service didn't matter anymore, and my struggles made me a burden. But that day, a store full of regular Louisiana folks reminded me that I still mattered, that we all matter when we choose to see each other with kindness instead of judgment." Those words stayed with his family long after Harold Whitaker passed away peacefully in his sleep just 6 months later in his modest apartment, surrounded by the simple comforts he had been able to maintain thanks to the support that continued even after that initial act of generosity. More than 50 people attended his funeral, including several customers and employees from the Safeway, some of whom had quietly continued helping him in the intervening months. His nephew delivered a moving eulogy that referenced the grocery store incident, telling those gathered how Uncle Harold had lived his final months differently, less afraid, more hopeful, and more deeply connected to the community around him, all because one person had chosen to act with decency rather than look away. Senator John Neely Kennedy learned of Harold's passing through a mutual acquaintance and, true to his character, sent a simple arrangement of flowers to the service with a handwritten card that read, "It was an honor to buy you coffee that day. Thank you for everything you gave to this country. John Neely Kennedy." The story did not explode into national headlines or viral videos. The few customers who had recorded short clips chose not to post them publicly out of respect for Harold's dignity. But it spread gently and meaningfully through Lafayette and the surrounding parishes, becoming one of those local legends that people told not for drama, but as a powerful example of what humanity looks like when it chooses compassion over indifference. The Veterans Assistance Fund at the Lafayette Safeway continued its quiet work long after that Tuesday morning, helping hundreds of other veterans in the years that followed and serving as a practical reminder that small, thoughtful systems could make a real difference in people's lives. For Senator Kennedy himself, the encounter remained a personal touchstone, a living illustration of why he had entered public service in the first place, and why he continued fighting in Washington for stronger support for America's veterans, better care for those who had sacrificed, and policies rooted in the core Louisiana values of personal responsibility, community, and respect for those who had defended the nation. So he would occasionally reference the story in private conversations, never for self-promotion, but to emphasize a deeper truth. That real change often begins not in grand legislative chambers, but in everyday places like grocery store checkout lines, where one person's willingness to say, "I've got this," can spark a chain reaction of goodness that spreads far beyond the moment itself. Looking back on the entire experience, the most important lesson that emerged from that morning in Lafayette was clear and powerful, one that deserved to be remembered and lived by anyone who heard the story. True strength is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is found in the quiet courage to notice someone else's struggle and choose to help without seeking praise or recognition. We must never forget to honor the men and women who have served this country, the veterans who answered the call, faced unimaginable hardships, and returned home carrying burdens that society too often overlooks. When we see a veteran counting coins for bread or facing a difficult day, our first response should never be judgment or impatience, but empathy and action. One small act of genuine kindness, offered with sincerity and without fanfare, has the power to restore dignity, spark generosity in others, and create a ripple effect that can heal hearts and strengthen entire communities. At its core, this story teaches us that every one of us faces hard days. Days when the bills don't quite add up, when the weight of the past feels heavy, or when life simply feels overwhelming. In those moments, see, the difference between despair and hope can be as simple as another person stepping forward and saying, "You're not alone. I've got this." That willingness to see each other as fellow human beings, to extend grace instead of criticism, and to live out the values of compassion and mutual respect is what truly builds a stronger, more decent society. Louisiana has long understood this truth in its bones. The spirit of looking out for one another, of honoring service, and of believing that no one should have to struggle in silence. If this story of an unassuming morning in a neighborhood Safeway moves you, let it serve as a personal challenge. Look for opportunities in your own daily life to offer kindness without expectation, to honor veterans not just with words but with actions, and to remember that we are all just trying to make it through our days the best we can. When we choose to lift one another up rather than turn away, we don't just help the person in front of us. We make our communities warmer, our country stronger, and our shared humanity brighter. That is the real legacy of what happened that morning. Not just the groceries that were paid for or the cash that was given, but the powerful reminder that hope can be reborn through the simplest acts of decency, and that each of us has the ability to be the person who steps forward when it matters most. In the end, the story of Senator John Neely Kennedy, Harold Whitaker, and the kind people of that Lafayette Safeway stands as a timeless lesson for all Americans. We are at our best when we choose empathy over indifference, gratitude over judgment, and community over isolation. May we all carry that lesson with us in our homes, our workplaces, our stores, and our hearts, so that no veteran, no neighbor, and no fellow citizen ever has to feel alone when facing a difficult day. Because, in the end, the true measure of a society is not found in its wealth or its power, but in how willingly its people choose to care for one another, especially for those who have given the most.